Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar about 229, Bill 229. I'm Dave Pierce with the Wildlands League, and today we'll be talking about, particularly about Bill 229 and why it's so important to respond to some of these problematic aspects with it. I'm the Forest Conservation Manager with Wildlands League, and today we have Anna Baggio, our Director of Conservation Planning, and Anastasia Lintner, who's an environmental lawyer. So I'll let Anna and Anastasia introduce themselves, and Eugenia also has Eugenia Kwok is with us, and she's our outreach coordinator for Wildlands League, and she will have some housekeeping items for our webinar today.
Great. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Anna Baggio, I'm the Conservation Director for Wildlands League. Just before I hand it over to Anastasia to say hello, I just wanted to acknowledge that Wildlands League has a long history of working with Indigenous peoples, and it's a bit difficult when you're on a webinar to certainly acknowledge the Indigenous peoples from wherever you are, but I just wanted to say that we acknowledge that Canada, all of Canada, has Indigenous peoples. It's either been their traditional land, their unceded land, or their treaties land, their treaty lands, and we strive to work within a framework of reconciliation. And I just would like to acknowledge that I am working from Guelph today. I live in Guelph, and the three territories that I wanted to acknowledge was the Dish with One Spoon territory, the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Between the Lakes purchase of Treaty 3. So thank you, and I look forward to a good session.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anastasia Lintner. I am here in Kingston, Ontario, as Lake Ontario turns into the St. Lawrence River, not very far from those shores. I am principal of Lintner Law, and I'm looking forward to giving you a little bit of some background and answering some of your questions today.
Great, thanks both. I'm Eugenia, I'm the outreach manager. I see I haven't changed my name, and I will do that now. I'm the outreach manager at Wildlands League. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you're just joining us right now, your video and microphone should be muted. We'll be speaking for about half an hour today, and then we'll leave some time at the end for some questions and some awesome answers. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the question box. I'll be monitoring them, and we'll try and answer them all at the end of this session. Back to you, Dave.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to introduce Wildlands League and a bit of our forestry work. So for you, anybody that doesn't know, Wildlands League is a nonprofit, non-governmental conservation organization. We're dedicated to the protection of wild spaces and wild species, particularly on public land or unceded traditional territory. We're very solutions oriented, and we like to work with collaboratively with governments, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and progressive industries, academics, ordinary citizens. But when collaboration doesn't work, we're not afraid to take a stand against governments and industrial actors that are advocating irresponsible development. So collectively, we have expertise on environmental policies and laws relating to nature, including forestry, endangered species, and protected areas. Eugenia, if you could go to the first slide. I just did a bit of a word cloud of our forestry experience. So we have a long and deep history in forestry, and we've tried many levers and little ways to try to improve the conservation of ecological values while under logging regimes. So we're members of Forest Stewardship Council and work on certification. We've promoted alternatives to clear cutting. We've worked on forest management plans, independent forest audits. We've exposed logging levels, which we think were too high. We've worked on ecosystem-based management approaches to logging, and we're involved in lots of committees and technical committees and Caribou Task Force and the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, the Caribou Mosaic, which is a way of trying to deal with caribou while still logging at the same time, which we think is quite problematic. But if we go to the next slide, our most recent work has really uncovered that we have a deforestation problem. We have a fundamental problem in this province. So Trevor in our office particularly highlighted what we're calling logging scars, which are patches of forest that aren't coming back after full tree harvesting and clear cutting after 30 years. And this land in Ontario accounts for an astounding 650,000 hectares, which is the size of a mid-sized provincial park like Quetico or Woodline Caribou Park. It's 10 times the size of the city of Toronto. It's a huge area that really isn't coming back, and it's really deforested. So what's really concerning for us is that the Ford government is putting forward policies that are premised on the fact that we are doing logging sustainably in Ontario, and logging scars is just a very compelling piece of evidence is that we're not doing really well in terms of being sustainable. So if we go to the next slide, if you want to learn more about our logging scars work, you can go to loggingscars.ca and find out more behind this. But then Anna's going to talk a bit more about why some of the things that have been proposed in Bill 229 are really problematic, given the history, especially the history in Ontario of unsustainable logging.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'll just set the stage for, I'll just help you get oriented in terms of the context, and then we will hand it over to Anastasia Lintner about the legal changes. So can you move to the next slide, Eugenia? So the key messages from me today is that we've seen red tape reduction and a deregulation to facilitate a doubling of logging in the province. Ontario says it wants to, through its new forest sector strategy, that it actually wants to target environmentally conscious consumers. Yet, it is weakening or removing environmental laws and their application. And we have two examples of that we'll talk about. In terms of the public consultations that happened with the forest sector strategy, they were failed and disingenuous in our view. And the final message, hopefully I can deliver today as part of this short presentation, is that the legal regimes, and when you look at the Endangered Species Act and the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, are distinct and they serve different purposes. And that's really important to understand as we look at why it's going to be so troubling to have forestry given a permanent exemption from restoring and protecting species at risk in Ontario. Next, Eugenia. So just to kind of get us oriented in terms of industrial forestry operations occur over a very large area of the province. And I just want to thank the Auditor General for publishing this very handy map. So I didn't have to have one made for today. So you can see it covers almost half the province. And forestry also overlaps with the habitat of about 50 species at risk, including caribou, migratory songbirds, all our turtles, or almost all our turtles. And so it is not a small undertaking. These are dramatic changes that are coming, and they're going to have dramatic effects. I'm also acknowledging that forestry is important for jobs, the local economy, and regional economies. And forests also serve very important characteristics for our society generally. They play a very important role in flood control. We need them for climate resilience. And then obviously there's other co-benefits related to, we spend time in the forest, spiritual renewal, many of our cultures are based in the forest. And so this is something we just have to get right. We just can't take our laws for granted, and we certainly can't just stand idly by if they're going to be dismantled. Next, Eugenia. And then in terms of the public, your right to participate in decisions, I just wanted to remind people that we do have an Environmental Bill of Rights in Ontario, and I just pulled up a couple quotes to describe that the purpose of the Environmental Bill of Rights is to better the environment and enable all Ontarians to participate in and hold our government to account. And also that, you have a right to participate in decisions. And so these are, two sources, one from the Government of Ontario, the other from the Auditor General. I just wanted to remind everybody that we have these rights, and it's really important that the public be listened to and that we can hold our governments to account. Next, Eugenia. The forest sector strategy, a draft was released in late 2019 for consultation. In fact, there were 6 postings that were rather confusing and dizzying in terms of when it happened. They had the consultation over the holiday period in December. We flagged from the very beginning that there were problems with the consultation process. It didn't seem like the public was a key audience of this consultation. We found out that industry stakeholders had been invited to meetings. The public was not. We learned then that the industry stakeholders also got a preview of the draft strategy. The public did not have that same opportunity. The public was directed to an email address. And so it's not surprising that it doesn't seem that this strategy was written in mind to be responsive to the needs of the people of Ontario. It seems that it was written to really advance the needs of a few in terms of the industry stakeholders. And the strategy lays out a doubling of logging without making the case or providing any evidence that the forest can actually sustain this or that it is sustainable, and other things that we will talk about that got implemented in legislation. Go ahead. In terms of public consultation, the Auditor General just provided us with a very handy assessment of how the province carried out their consultation. And if you haven't had a chance, take a look at what they've written. They have a lot of people that worked on this, but I will acknowledge that the Auditor General, it's her office. But I do appreciate and acknowledge there's a number of experts in that office. And this particular, you can see that in this particular quote that I've pulled, that they recognize and they've determined that Ontarians were not given sufficient information and time to comment on the government's decisions related to the forest management and the changes that they were proposing. They flagged that these 6 proposals were going to significantly change what was happening, and that the ministry's approach to consultation was not was not consistent with the purposes of the Environmental Bill of Rights. And so the Auditor General has weighed in and said that there's been problems with the consultation process as well. And in terms of how we've been specifically interacting with forestry, as Dave mentioned, we have a very long history of trying to improve the way forestry operations have been done in Ontario. And since 2008, we have been following and tracking the processes the process very closely in terms of how was the government of Ontario going to reconcile these the two systems, one for the CFSA, which is quite old, from 1994, but then the new one that came in 2008, the Endangered Species Act. And since 2008, the province has really failed to bring in protections for boreal caribou consistent with the original intention of the Endangered Species Act, which is to protect and recover species. And if you aren't familiar with this particular tension between these two legal regimes, the reason why we even needed an Endangered Species Act in the first place is because resource statutes like logging, that enable mining, these statutes have been predicated on a premise that they will enable you to cut, but then they will mitigate. And they will mitigate the impacts to, endangered species or what other value we may care about. And this approach where you just mitigate has been left wanting and has failed really to stop the decline of species at risk in this province. And this is one of the big reasons why we needed a new piece of legislation and why there was such a groundswell to bring in a new law in 2007 that would actually start to rectify this and prioritize the protection and recovery of species, because resource statutes didn't cover it. What we observed, though, and what we objected to was that the governments since 2008 have consistently and exempted forestry through a series of temporary exemptions from ever having to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. And so we've had a series of temporary exemptions from 2008, and now here we are in 2020, and we find ourselves with Bill 229. Eugenia? And just to, I've laid out this table just to kind of show people and that the Endangered Species Act is really about protecting and recovering species. The Crown Forest Sustainability Act from 1994 is about how do you log and then mitigate. And so these are two very different standards, serve two very different purposes. And also in terms of the scale, forestry operates on a forest management unit scale. The Endangered Species Act, you know, they can come up with the regulations could be scaled to the habitat needs of the species. So for example, with a particular species like woodland caribou, you would need the scale to be addressed at a range level. In terms of what it prioritizes, you know, the CFSA is a balancing, whereas the ESA prioritizes the habitat and the species needs. And then there's all other differences. And then the last one I thought I would just draw your attention to is, it's kind of hard to believe, but a species could continue to decline under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, whereas under the ESA, it's expressly designed to stop the decline and then improve their state. And so these are very different things happening with these two pieces of legislation. What we saw in 2019 is that the provincial governments indicated that they were going to permanently exempt forestry from the ESA and abandon. So there had been this commitment the previous provincial governments were tracking to, the previous governments were saying, okay, we're ultimately going to reconcile these two systems. We've got the one system, we've got the second system, but we're going to bring them together. We're going to make it work. The Ford government abandoned that commitment, and then frankly even falsely claimed that there was duplication. And so this was quite troubling and alarming that this is now that we had people that were about to just have an entire industry exempt from protecting and recovering species in Ontario. And then this is just a case example of what, if you want to dive in onto the difference between how the legislative regimes would treat, for example, boreal caribou. If you look at what caribou need, and I won't go into all the details, but for example, caribou need their critical habitat protected. Could you get that under an ESA regime? Yes. Would you get that under a CFSA regime? No. Are you going to get cumulative disturbance monitoring under an ESA regime? Yes, a well-designed one, absolutely. That's what caribou need. Do we get that under CFSA? No. And so these are just some of the things, if you were to look at, just to give you an example about what a species might need and then what they would be getting, it's very different under the two regimes. And if we look at where we are today with respect to, I'm calling it a snapshot of where we are. With respect to public forests, our environmental oversight, protections, and including participation, we can see that in terms of environmental assessment and forests, oh, Eugenia, you have to hit a button. Sorry, I was hitting a button, but you have to hit it. Yeah, there we go. So forestry in the last bill, Bill 197, has now been exempt from environmental assessment, so we don't have that. Eugenia, can you hit the next one? With Bill 229, if it passes, there will be no longer, it'll be permanently exempt from endangered species legislation. Eugenia, go ahead. With the, so with the Environmental Bill of Rights, we've seen the Ford government find ways to circumvent public consultation, and or there's even, it's been alleged that they've actually tried to, get out of these requirements through what they've done in legislation. And so we have very weak public participation and consultation. And then what are we left with? We're left with the Crown Forest Sustainability Act from 1994, and it needs to be reformed. And this legislation is out of date, and it's not serving Ontarians. Eugenia, can you hit the button again? And so when you layer in what the Ford government has done, removing these key environmental protections, we have very weak public consultation, sometimes none at all. And then we've got a doubling of logging. We have a deregulation agenda, the public's being left out. We have disrespecting of Indigenous rights and everything being tilted in favor of industry. we're going to be getting more of what we don't want. And that is going to be, Eugenia, you got one more button? We're going to be getting more of this, which is wasteful practices that lead to logging scars and that lead to more increased risk for our species at risk, and that ultimately are going to leave us worse off and in a more precarious position. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anastasia Lintner.
And sorry, Anna, before you start, I see somebody's raising their hands. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dave and Anna, for your overview of the excellent work of Wildlands League and the understanding of where we are today. My job is to take you through three things. One is sort of, what is this bill? How do we get here? What does the bill say in Schedule 8 with respect to the proposed amendments of forestry? And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we call a legislative timeline, what we're expecting happens next. So go ahead, Eugenia. So this bill, numbered 229, is the proposed budget measures bill that will be called Protect, Support, and Recover from COVID-19 Act. It was introduced for first reading to the Ontario Legislature on November 5th, and on November 23rd, the government had its final vote on a time allocation motion. And what this means is that the time allocation motion is the government or somebody bringing a motion to the legislature that asks to set out exactly how the process will go and in this particular situation, expedite it and limit the amount of time that will be available for the usual process. So normally bills go first reading, second reading debate, committee, often public hearings, committee does what's called clause by clause and decides on any amendments. That committee is a standing committee of the legislature. It has all parties represented, make some amendments, report back to the legislature for third reading and the final debate. With a time allocation motion, the sequencing and the amount of time is prescribed or laid out, and in this case, fast-tracked or expedited in a manner that I'll tell you about a little bit more in a minute. This bill, as a budget measures bill, it's introduced by the Minister of Finance and implementing their budget, the government's budget. This one in particular contains 44 different schedules and affects approximately 100 different pieces of legislation. And for two reasons, these are exempt from the usual practice of bringing environmentally significant decisions to the public through the Environmental Registry for an opportunity to comment and have those comments considered before making the final decision. So in being exempt, there's a specific exemption for sort of administrative measures that implement a government's budget, but also the Minister of Finance is not one of the listed ministries that's required to do public consultation through the Environmental Bill of Rights. And so there hasn't been the opportunity to comment through Environmental Bill of Rights, protected participation rights, and this particular bill is being expedited through the legislative process as well. Next slide. And what does this particular piece of proposed legislation say about the Crown Forest Sustainability Act? It's quite short in terms of the number of amendments that are being proposed, but basically the provisions will, first of all, add a definition for endangered species into the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. And then it does two other things that I want to bring to your attention. The first is that there'll be a new provision under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, numbered 47.1, that if a forest operation is occurring on public land, so within that area of undertaking that Anna put up the map for us, on public land under the authority of the Crown or a forest resource license, and is operated with respect to a forest management plan, then that activity will be exempt from what would otherwise be prohibited under the Endangered Species Act. And not only that, but perhaps more alarming, the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks with powers under the Endangered Species Act to issue orders to protect a particular species from being harmed or killed, or to put in a protection order around its habitat to not be able to destroy or damage its habitat. Those protection orders can also not be issued by the minister if a forest operator is undergoing the activity as I described before on public land under the authority of the Crown or their license, and with a forest management plan, in accordance with a forest management plan. The second thing that is going on, thanks Eugenia, just quickly, is that there will also be an ability for the, under the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, for new regulations to be made by Cabinet that could deal with things like minimizing or avoiding the impacts on species or assisting with the recovery of species. And I'll say two things. One is that's that kind of language of the regulations they might bring into place is not the kind of language that we see in the Endangered Species Act about being sure there's protection and restoration and recovery and aiming for recovery. It's more like the kinds of impacts that we're already doing with the resource management species that Anna was describing, that we avoid or we minimize, not actually protect and work towards recovery. And the second thing is that with any regulations, they're completely discretionary. The fact that this new power will exist for regulations to be made does not obligate the Cabinet to make new regulations. Next slide. So what's next? How are we moving through this process? There is generally an opportunity for the public to have their say when a piece of legislation goes to a standing committee through public hearings, where you can request to present orally, all virtually now in this strange space we're in. And you can also make written comments. That process, as I said, has been expedited. So written comments to the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs are going to be due 7 p.m. on December 2nd. There's going to be a very rapid clause-by-clause consideration of this massive bill on December 4th, and it will be reported back to the legislature on December 7th, regardless of how far the committee gets. And then third reading could commence immediately that day, and the bill could ultimately be passed on that day. So that very shortened, limiting process is now going to play out. And that's all that I have to say. So I'll turn it back over to whoever's making those final words. Anna Baggio, are you
Yes,
next?
that's me.
Okay.
Thanks, Anastasia. Appreciate that. Anna's been amazing in terms of helping us get a handle on what their changes to the laws are coming fast and furious with this government, and we need our legal experts to help us understand what that they mean. And so I've been very appreciative of Anna's legal expertise and helping us to understand what on earth is happening, and then again helping us then help all of you. So how to take action and how to communicate with your member of provincial parliament. We have set up an action center at loggingscars.ca, and it's very simple. We even have a sample letter there just for you to click on. You can either modify the letter, you can add your own personal sentiments. We've made it very simple. You type in your postal code and your MPP's name will pop up, and a copy will also be sent to the Minister of Finance and Premier Ford. When this has been happening, the MPPs often will start to respond to you with a stock response that they will get from the Ministry of Natural Resources. Let us know, and we would be happy to help you respond to that. And Eugenia, is it possible to pull up loggingscars.ca so we can show people?
Yes, I can. I can pull this up at the end.
Okay, and then if we just go to the next slide, I just want to say we'll go to Logging Scars after. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. We will be having a future webinar on how Ontario is failing on protected areas, and don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. I just wanted to make you all aware that a video recording of this webinar will be available later this week. And I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and listening to us and you know, being interested in this really important issue. I want to thank Eugenia for hosting us. I want to thank Dave for emceeing and sharing his expertise. And I want to thank Anastasia as well for sharing her legal expertise. So with that, we will. And do you want to just throw up the Action Center, Eugenia?
Yes, Anna, I can throw up the Action Center. We have a few questions here.
Okay.
So the first question is, will there be a detailed summary of key failures of Schedule 8 and recommendations for comments to government swiftly? Public hearings for 229 are scheduled for November 30th, December 1st and 2nd, and these posts where we can access them. And then thank you for your work.
Yes, so if you go to loggingscars.ca and click on the Take Action, you will see the Action Center is there. And then there is a link called More Resources. So you can use what we've given you as a template. And if you want to, you can also devise your own emails. Feel free to use our system to send your own note to your MPP. But there are also links to more resources. So you have Anna's legal opinion. You will have we've put some pieces together to help you formulate your responses. And it's all there, loggingscars.ca/ and you can just click the Take Action button.
And so this is our Take Action on our website. It is loggingscars.ca/take action. You can scroll down and submit. We even have a pre-written letter ready.
That's great.
We have a second question here. Can you speak briefly to Schedule 40 in Bill 229?
Anastasia, do you want us to take that one?
Yes, I was just rapidly trying to rifle through my desk and find my notes on that. So do you want to go to the next question? I'll see if I have them handy enough to be helpful.
And we had one more question. Is the webinar available? Yes, it will be, and we'll make sure that everyone here today and those who have missed it will be able to have access to that recording. And Dave, do you have any questions from this presentation?
Do I have any questions? Not off the top of my head. I'm wondering what Schedule 40 is. I'm waiting with bated breath.
So yeah, what I can tell you off the top of my head is Schedule 40 within Bill 229 makes some proposed amendments to the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act. It has it has a number of it's lengthier than the very sort of, it's very clear what the key amendments are because they're quite short around how the changes around endangered species versus forestry is happening in the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. The suite of changes that are being proposed under Schedule 40 for the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act, I just haven't had enough time to really absorb them and sort of pull out what are the key ones. But it is something that I have been working on and chatting with Wildlands League about. So if we can turn around a little bit more information relatively quickly, then we will get back to people who registered. How does that sound?
Sounds great. if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to put them in the question box now, and we can wait for a few more seconds for more questions. I think those are all the questions for today. Dave, would you like to end off our webinar today?
Well, just reiterate thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks for some thoughtful questions. And we hope everyone will do what they can to take action, and hopefully, you know, push back on some of these egregious proposals.
Oh, I got one thing too. I know people might feel like it is a bit discouraging because it is a majority government, and yes, it is discouraging that they have the power to push this through. However, it is really important that we all speak up. We have to speak up when these things happen, because it sends a signal not only to the governing party, but also to the other parties that we're paying attention, that we do not support these actions. And it's really important that we register our dissent. And so I know it might be disheartening that these things could be pushed through, but we have to stand up and we have to fight. And I thank you all for your interest, and we have to keep going. So thank you. Thank you for caring.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody.